The ballroom fell silent. Not the kind of polite silence that follows a speech, but the kind that rolls through a room like a wave, stopping music, freezing laughter, making even chandeliers seem to hold their breath. All it took was the sound of the grand doors of the Ritz Paris swinging open. For a single, suspended heartbeat, 200 of Europe's wealthiest and most powerful people forgot their conversations, their champagne, their carefully rehearsed social performances. Because Naomi Carter had returned. She did not walk in. She arrived, like a storm that had finally found its target. She stood, framed in the golden light of the foyer, the black silk of her gown catching the crystal shimmer from the chandeliers above. It was the kind of entrance that made cameras twitch in photographers' hands before they even remembered to breathe. Her presence didn't just fill the room, it commanded it. If this story already has your heart racing, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow this channel for the next chapters of Naomi's story. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Naomi's skin, a deep and luminous onyx, reflected the warm light like polished marble. Every detail was deliberate, the sharp, elegant line of her jaw, the cascade of natural curls woven into a sculpted updo, the bold red on her lips, daring anyone to look away. She didn't need a crown to look like royalty. She was the crown. The string quartet faltered. Waiters froze mid-step. Conversations snapped in half like fragile glass. It wasn't because the guests didn't recognize her. They did. It was because they thought they'd seen the last of her. 18 months earlier, Naomi Carter had vanished from this world. Discarded, humiliated, whispered about in marble hallways and Parisian salons. She'd been the woman who married into power, only to be cast aside for someone younger, blonder, and more convenient to the narrative. The kind of woman society swallows whole and then forgets. But tonight the story was different. She walked forward slowly, not out of hesitation but out of power, the kind that doesn't need to rush to be felt. The black silk gown trailed like liquid night behind her, and the golden embroidery along the seams flickered like tiny flames with every measured step. She was the fire they'd tried to bury. Heads turned. Whispers spread like an electric current. Is that Naomi? She looks, my God. I thought she left for good. At the far end of the ballroom, Ethan Whitmore, heir to a shipping empire, her ex-husband, the man who had once broken her heart as easily as snapping a stem of a rose, stiffened. His glass tilted slightly in his hand, the champagne trembling like his pulse. Clara Jensen, the young influencer who now clung to his arm, turned too, her practiced smile faltering. Naomi didn't look at them. She didn't need to. Her gaze swept past Ethan as if he were a detail in the background of a painting she no longer cared to study. Instead, she locked eyes with the crowd ahead of her, the same people who had once turned away from her as though shame was contagious. And then it happened. One person, no one quite remembered who, began to clap. Just a single pair of hands at first, like a match struck in the dark, then another, and another. And soon the entire ballroom erupted in a slow building applause, not for Ethan, not for Parisian tradition, but for her, for the woman who had walked through hell and returned in silk and fire. Naomi Carter didn't bow. She lifted her chin a fraction higher, her eyes gleaming. This was not forgiveness. This was arrival. Some stories begin quietly, with a whisper. Hers began with a room full of people realizing they'd underestimated the wrong woman. And this was only the beginning. Paris had always been a city that swallowed people whole. Some disappeared in its quiet corners, and some, like Naomi Carter, bloomed beneath its light. 7 years before the night she stopped a ballroom with a single step, she arrived with nothing but a suitcase, a scholarship, and a heart that beat with reckless hope. The city welcomed her the way Paris welcomes dreamers, cruelly and beautifully, with rain that soaked through her coat and streets that glittered like possibility. Naomi came as a Fulbright scholar in cultural economics, one of those bright, determined black women who knew how to make themselves undeniable. She had grown up in Atlanta, raised by a mother who told her that excellence wasn't a choice, it was armor. Paris was meant to be a stepping stone. She had no idea it would also become the battlefield where she would be tested, broken, and reborn. In those first months, Every street corner was a discovery. The pale stone facades, the scent of butter and roasted chestnuts, the hush of the Seine at dusk. She fell in love with the rhythm of the city, the click of heels on cobblestone, the low hum of cafe conversations, the unapologetic way Parisians occupied space. She wanted to learn how to move like that, unapologetically. She met Ethan Whitmore on a spring night at a reception hosted by the American Embassy. The event was meant to be formal, forgettable. It wasn't. Ethan entered with the ease of someone who had never had to wonder if he belonged anywhere. He carried wealth the way some men carry their breath, effortlessly. His white dinner jacket caught the light. His smile caught the room. He found her near the dessert table, standing alone with a glass of champagne she couldn't quite afford to like. "You look like someone who'd rather be anywhere else," he said. His voice had that polished New England timbre, smooth, educated, unshakable. Naomi laughed. "And you look like someone who's used to being exactly where he wants to be." He grinned, and the city shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. That night, they walked along the Seine as if the world belonged to them. They spoke of books, of cities they'd never seen, of futures they had not yet imagined. Naomi didn't notice the way he looked at her, not the way men usually did, with curiosity or caution, but with fascination, as though she were a language he wanted to learn. Their worlds couldn't have been more different. Naomi worked nights tutoring international students to make rent in a sixth-floor walk-up that smelled faintly of garlic and ambition. Ethan lived in a townhouse on Avenue Montaigne, the kind of place with a doorman who pretended not to judge. He was the heir to Whitmore Global Logistics, a family empire that shipped everything from rare wines to medical equipment. He was born with a safety net. Naomi was still stitching hers together with thread and fire. But opposites are magnetic, and soon the city was their accomplice. Their love unfolded in opera houses and late-night boulangeries, in whispered conversations on the Pont Alexander III, as the river carried away their secrets. Naomi learned how to taste oysters and vintage champagne. Ethan learned how to listen, not to the noise of privilege, but to the heartbeat of a woman who had built herself from the ground up. He told her he'd never met anyone like her. She wanted to believe him. They spent weekends at art exhibitions, rooftop jazz lounges, and quiet bistros tucked into narrow streets where nobody cared about last names. Naomi fell into him like stepping into warm water, hesitant at first, then weightless. She had never felt so seen, so chosen. For a woman who had spent years proving she belonged in every room, being adored without condition was intoxicating. But there were moments, small, delicate fractures that she ignored. The raised brows when they entered certain galleries hand in hand. The way waiters sometimes handed the check to Ethan, not her. The polite, careful smiles from his circle of old money friends. She told herself love would be enough, that Paris would bend before it would break her. The night Ethan proposed, the Eiffel Tower glittered against a violet sky. He dropped to one knee on the Pont Neuf, and the world seemed to still for them. "Marry me, Naomi," he whispered. "Let's build a life that no one can question." She said yes. She said it because she loved him. She said it because she believed that love could silence the world's doubts. She said it because, in that moment, Paris didn't feel like a foreign city. It felt like home. But fairy tales in Paris don't end with carriages. They end with golden masks, with secrets whispered behind champagne glasses, with the quiet knowledge that every dream has a price. And Naomi, though she didn't know it yet, had just signed hers. The day Paris crowned them as its favorite couple, the sky was the kind of blue that painters spend lifetimes trying to capture. A spring sun glowed over the gardens of Château de Chantilly, casting light through rows of white roses arranged with military precision. It was the wedding of the year, not merely an exchange of vows, but a performance. And the city's elite had gathered for their front row seats. Naomi Carter stood behind a pair of carved oak doors, her hands steady, her breath long and controlled. The silk of her gown, soft ivory with gold hand embroidery, swept across the polished floors like a whispered promise. It had taken an atelier 6 months to stitch it. Every thread meant to say, "She belongs here." But beneath the gown, beneath the diamonds and borrowed tradition, a single truth pulsed in her chest. She was stepping into a world built to adore her only if she never forgot she was a guest. The doors opened to a swell of music, not the loud, clattering kind, but a rising, elegant symphony that seemed to lift her from the earth itself. 200 faces turned toward her, ministers, diplomats, heirs and heiresses, journalists pretending to be invisible. Cameras flashed in polite restraint. A ripple ran through the crowd. There she was, the girl from Atlanta who'd walked into Paris and caught one of its most powerful men. Ethan Whitmore waited at the altar beneath an arch of magnolias, dressed in a bespoke white tuxedo, his hair catching sunlight like spun gold. He looked almost mythic. His smile was practiced but warm, the kind of smile that had always made Naomi feel both chosen and caged. She began walking down the aisle, the long train trailing behind her like a story already being written. She caught glimpses as she walked, faces arranged in admiration that carried an undercurrent she had learned to read. Whispers folded in silk. She's beautiful, but so unexpected. An American, black too. He's bold marrying her. They smiled at her with perfect manners, but their eyes were measuring, weighing, deciding where she fit in their world. Ethan, in contrast, didn't seem to notice. He looked at her as though the room, the whispers, the centuries of expectation meant nothing. In that moment, Naomi let herself believe him. Believe in love louder than history. The ceremony unfolded with the precision of an opera. The priest's French flowed like music. Naomi's mother, elegant and fierce in emerald silk, dabbed at her eyes. Ethan's father, tall and silver-haired, nodded approvingly as though confirming a strategic investment. When Ethan placed the diamond ring, a Whitmore family heirloom, on her finger, a chorus of clicks from photographers filled the air. This wasn't just a union, it was spectacle, a merging of worlds. When the priest declared them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her with a confidence that made the crowd lean forward, as if they too were part of the fairy tale. Naomi felt her pulse steady against his touch. In that suspended instant, she wasn't an outsider, or a headline, or an elegant disruption. She was simply a woman in love. The reception spilled across the chateau gardens like something pulled from a dream. A jazz quartet played beneath strings of gold lights. Crystal flutes overflowed with champagne. Guests danced beneath the trimmed hedges, murmuring about the grandeur, the spectacle, the Whitmore name. Naomi was radiant, wrapped in silk and soft light, her laugh easy and unguarded. For a night, she allowed herself to believe the applause was real. But even in the music and the applause, subtle fractures whispered beneath the surface. Clara Jensen, Ethan's family friend, a blonde model with a laugh like spun sugar, hovered too close, her presence sanctioned by Ethan's circle. A countess whispered something behind a gloved hand. Naomi caught the glance, the look that said, beautiful, but temporary. Later, Ethan's best man raised a glass. To Naomi, he said, his smile a polished blade, for being brave enough to step into our world. Laughter rippled through the tables, not cruel, not yet, but sharp enough for Naomi to feel its edge. She smiled anyway, because that was what was expected. She caught her reflection in the window of the ballroom. Diamonds sparkling, silk perfect, every detail aligned with their idea of grace. Yet the woman staring back didn't quite look like the girl who once walked the streets of Paris with nothing but ambition and a paper map. And still, she chose to believe in the story. She chose to hold Ethan's hand and dance beneath the chandeliers as fireworks bloomed over the chateau. It was their night, and she told herself it would last forever. But in a city like Paris, fairy tales don't last forever. They shimmer brilliantly, right before they crack. At first, the changes were so small, Naomi mistook them for shadows. A postponed dinner, a meeting that ran long, a quiet that settled between them like dust, so fine, so ordinary, that she learned to breathe through it without noticing. Years had gentled Paris into the steady rhythm of their marriage. Their apartment near the Place Vendôme rested in soft symmetries. Hydrangeas in a crystal vase, a stack of journals by the window, Ethan's cufflinks glinting on the console like small, silver decisions. In the evenings, Naomi would light a candle that smelled faintly of cedar and bergamot and listen for his key in the door. Sometimes it came, Sometimes the night drifted past without it. "It's year end," he would say, loosening his tie. "Port delays. Regulatory nonsense. I'll be late this week." This week became a season, and the seasons lengthened. It was not a single betrayal. It was a scatter of absences. He grew fluent in the language of almosts, almost home, almost free, almost present. His phone began to lie face down on the table, vibrating like a heartbeat he didn't want her to hear. When she asked where he'd been, his answers were competent, not warm. Names of ships, cities, meetings, facts that felt like curtains instead of windows. The invitations told their own story. At first they were addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, the opera, the museum gala, a vineyard supper in Burgundy. Then came the new phrasing. "Ethan will of course join us. Colleagues only this quarter. You understand, investors." She understood too well. The rooms they had once entered side by side were recalibrating for one. At a board dinner, the host clasped Ethan's shoulder with old boys club familiarity and turned to Naomi with a smile polished by generations. "You must be exhausted with all the travel he does." Terrible thing, logistics. He laughed, as though the joke were harmless. Then he forgot to introduce her. She sat through 3 courses of affable exclusion, her title reduced to wife, her expertise, decades of research on cultural economies, glossed over like a footnote. When the conversation grazed her field, Ethan did not look to her. He spoke for her, kindly, flawlessly, the way one speaks for a beautiful portrait. The city responded in subtler tones. A maitre d' who asked if she was with Mr. Whitmore's party while staring past her shoulder. A gallery patron who admired her dress and, with the same breath, asked who styled her, as though intellect were a rumor and elegance the only credential she could claim. Naomi smiled with the restraint of a woman who knows the price of exploding in the wrong room. At home, the silences acquired shape. They had once filled their kitchen with arguments about novels and policy, tasting sauces and sentences in the same breath. Now Ethan ate standing up, scrolling. When she spoke about a proposal for Bridge and Bloom, a collaboration that would connect Parisian artisans with Ghanaian designers, he nodded, distracted, and called it sweet. The word landed like a paper cut, small, invisible, stinging for hours. She began to measure the distance between them in domestic rituals gone awry, his suit jacket draped on a second chair instead of the hook they'd chosen together. A wine glass rinsed but never returned to the shelf. A note on the counter that read, "Back late," with no punctuation, as if even certainty had lost its confidence. There were, too, moments of brightness that hurt in their own way. On a Sunday morning, he brought croissants and kissed the corner of her mouth with the softness of a memory. "Let's go away," he said. "Corsica. Just us," she let herself believe. By evening, he was on a call in the hallway saying, "Of course, we'll host them. Yes, just me. Makes more sense." The trip disappeared without ever existing, like condensation on a glass. In the mirror, Naomi watched her own expression evolve. She had learned to perfect the face of composure, the posture of a woman undisturbed by doors closing quietly behind her. But inside, something precise and relentless began to assemble. A ledger of dismissals, a taxonomy of erasures. She was a scholar of patterns. She could not unsee them in her life. When she reached for him at night, he turned in his sleep, not away so much as aside. It was a geography of the heart, one small shift at a time until maps no longer matched the road. She stopped asking why he was late. The question had become a choreography. His sigh, her pause, the explanation with numbers and deadlines, the apology that felt professionally formatted. She hated the person she became in those exchanges. Reasonable, patient, edited. The walls didn't close with a slam. They whispered inward. Invitations rerouted, jokes told over her, plans made around her. She walked through rooms whose light she once helped arrange and found herself cast in shadow. The castle was still glass, beautiful, transparent, but now she understood the trick. Glass is both window and barrier. You can see everything and still not be allowed inside. One night, rain stitched the city into a single silver fabric. Naomi stood at the window, watching taillights smear the street into ribbons. There had been a time she would have texted him, "Are you safe?" Now she wondered whether safety was the problem. That easy safety he wore like a custom suit, the certainty that the world would bend to him. She thought of the girl who had crossed the ocean with a scholarship and a steel spine. Where had she gone? When had she traded her questions for patience, her ferocity for poise? The key turned at 1:12 a.m. Ethan entered, smelling of rain and success. "I didn't want to wake you," he said, already moving past her. "I wasn't asleep," she answered, voice even, almost gentle. He paused then, finally looking at her, really looking. For a moment, the past flickered. The boy on Pont Neuf who promised a life no one could question. "You know this quarter," he said softly. "It's complicated." "So am I," Naomi replied. He kissed her forehead as if blessing a story he no longer had time to hear, and the door to the guest room clicked with a politeness that felt like betrayal. In the morning, the city smelled of wet stone and coffee, and Naomi dressed for a meeting she would attend alone. As she looped her scarf, she realized the truth she'd been resisting. Love hadn't left. It had simply been outgrown by something louder: expectation, image, inevitability. And beneath the ache, another feeling stirred. Barely a sound at first, the opening note of a violin tuning in the dark. It was not anger. Not yet. It was awareness. It happened on a Wednesday that looked harmless. Paris rinsed clean by a thin winter rain, the air bright with that particular light that makes even strangers look cinematic. Naomi had finished a meeting near Place Vendôme and cut through the arcade to avoid the drizzle. She might have kept walking. She might have never looked up. But the window display at Le Maire Joaillier caught her. A collar of emeralds so pure they seemed lit from within. A river of green set in white fire. Inside, the boutique was hushed, perfumed with iris and polished wood. Naomi stepped in, more to escape the rain than to shop, and paused as an associate offered tea with choreographed warmth. That was when she heard Ethan laugh, low, familiar, the sound of a door she used to open without asking. He stood at the far counter, back half turned, shoulders relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in months. Beside him, a young woman tilted her swan neck to the mirror. Clara Jensen. Naomi knew the name the way one knows a storm. The girl had been skimming the edges of their world for a year. Front row photos, brand trips, captions about boss energy. Up close, Clara was as curated as a feed. Platinum hair in soft waves, skin like poured cream, a mouth practiced in surprise. "Try the emeralds," Ethan said, softer now, the private voice. The jeweler lifted the necklace like a sacrament and clasped it at Clara's nape. Green spilled across her collarbones, a meadow after rain. Clara gasped, and the room obeyed. Naomi did not move. The boutique's mirrors multiplied everything: the light, the gems, the betrayal, until it felt like standing in a kaleidoscope of her own undoing. She thought of the night she and Ethan had picked out her wedding earrings in this very room, how he'd turned to her then with reverence, with certainty. The saleswoman who recognized her now did not let it show. Professionalism can be a form of cruelty. Clara angled her chin, admiring. "Is it too much?" she asked, a performance designed to invite reassurance. "For my lifestyle?" Ethan's reflection met Naomi's, and for the briefest beat the world went soundless. Then he blinked, chose not to see her, and smiled at Clara instead. "It's perfect," he said, voice smooth as silk. "You're perfect for my lifestyle." The sentence slid under Naomi's ribs, cold and precise. Perfect for my lifestyle. Not partner, not equal. A decorative fit, a seamless accessory for a brand. The words rang with a frequency only she could hear, a summation of every edited introduction, every missing seat at a table, every time her complexity had been handed a coat check ticket in rooms built by men like him. The associate at Naomi's elbow whispered, "Madam?" She realized she was gripping her gloves so tightly the leather creaked. She placed them on the glass, found her voice, and asked to see nothing at all. Then she left. Not quickly. She would not give the room that, but with a steadiness that felt like the first line of a new contract with herself. Outside, the rain had returned, thin needles stitching the boulevard to the sky. Naomi walked without umbrella, the cold clarifying. By the time she reached the corner, the decision had already been made. She only had to say it aloud to make it real. That evening, she waited for Ethan at the apartment, with the lights low and the truth lit high. He arrived smelling of wet wool and the quiet triumph of a successful purchase. When she said, "I'm filing for divorce," his pupils widened, then narrowed the way a camera adjusts to brightness. He set his keys down carefully, as though noise might change the outcome. "Naomi," he began, tone managerial, "let's be rational." "Rational is all I have left," she said. He didn't deny Clara. He didn't apologize, not precisely. Instead, he reached for vocabulary that had always served him. Misaligned goals, difficult quarters, public image, timing. When she didn't flinch, he changed tools. "You'll be protected," he offered. "The prenup ensures." "The prenup protects you," she answered, calm as a signed affidavit. There it was, the quiet guillotine she'd agreed to years ago when love felt invincible. A document drafted in rooms where she'd been offered champagne instead of counsel, assuring that the townhouse, the investments, the art, the equity in his father's good name, all of it lived on his side of the ledger. She had her salary, her savings, her company just beginning to become itself. He had the rest. Power, when it is legal, is very hard to argue with. The next days moved with surgical efficiency. His lawyer called first, soothing, immaculate, promising discretion like a luxury fabric. Then came a publicist with a statement template. Mutual respect, divergent paths, continued friendship. A choreography of erasure so polished it gleamed. Invitations evaporated without smoke. The charity board asked her to take a sabbatical for optics. A gallery retracted a panel appearance with an apology that blamed the calendar. Clara's Instagram bloomed in the vacuum, a hand with that emerald fire resting on a white tablecloth, a caption about choosing joy. Comment sections are a kind of courtroom without rules. The verdict arrives faster when beauty is the evidence. In the apartment, the silence became geometric. Naomi packed not as a defeated woman, but as a precise one, folding each blouse like a clause, slipping photographs into envelopes as if redacting her own archive. On the final morning, she paused in the doorway and looked back at the life she had curated into elegance. She felt grief, yes, the honest kind, but beneath it, something steadier took root. Not rage, not yet. Clarity. The castle had been glass all along. Now she knew where every seam ran, which panel cut, which pane lied. She closed the door gently, as if not to wake whatever version of herself had once slept there, and stepped into the bright, indifferent morning with a spine made of decision. Paris watched. Some pretended not to see, some took notes, but a few, quiet, necessary witnesses, recognized what had truly happened. The breaking wasn't the end. It was the sound a future makes when it unhooks itself from a cage. It didn't happen all at once. Erasure never does. It begins quietly, almost politely, like frost forming overnight on a window pane. One day, Naomi Carter was on the inside of Paris's gilded social world, an invited name, a whispered reference, a face the city's elite were eager to be photographed beside. The next, she found herself standing in the same rooms she'd once ruled, feeling their edges push her out. The first sign was subtle, a charity event for global literacy. She'd sat on its organizing board for 4 years, chaired 2 galas, and built partnerships that had doubled its funding. When the formal invitations arrived this year, hers didn't. She assumed a mistake. She called an acquaintance, someone who had once greeted her with air kisses and "ma chérie." "Ah, Naomi," the woman said, her voice honey over knives. "We thought, with everything happening, it might be kinder not to put you through the spotlight." Kinder, that was the first blade. Soon the dinner party stopped. Ethan's world, their shared world, had always run on invisible calendars, invitations sliding through private channels like currency. No one said she was unwelcome. They simply said nothing at all. The restaurant hosts who used to greet her by name now hesitated, waiting to see whether she was alone. Some smiled too brightly, trying to pretend they hadn't read the gossip. And there was gossip. Clara's emerald necklace had done its work. She and Ethan had become a story. And Naomi, the discarded wife, had become a headline that didn't need her presence to be told. The charities she had championed, Arts foundations, refugee literacy programs, cultural preservation initiatives, sent carefully worded letters. Restructuring of the board, transitioning to a new strategy. We so appreciate your years of dedication. It was the language of erasure in its most elegant form. The same people who had toasted her brilliance at galas were now scrubbing her name from brochures and websites. They didn't want a reminder that their golden couple had fractured. Power, she realized, was not just about wealth. It was about who got to remain visible when the story changed. Her closest friends fractured along familiar fault lines. Some slipped away without explanation. Others offered brittle kindness, the kind that came with the sound of distance being measured. A few, very few, stood beside her quietly. But most had already decided proximity to Ethan's world was more valuable than loyalty to hers. One afternoon, she walked into L'Atelier Rouge, a gallery where she'd once curated cultural exchange exhibits between West African and French artists. The receptionist, who used to greet her with, "Bonjour, Madame Carter," glanced nervously before saying, "Do you have an appointment?" Naomi looked past her at the main room. On the wall where her portrait once hung, taken after her keynote on global arts funding, was a blank space, clean, painted over. That night, she opened her inbox to a flurry of politely phrased absences, canceled collaborations, timing conflicts, messages without warmth. Her phone, once a symphony of invitations, went still. The silence had a texture now, cold, deliberate, and heavy. She hadn't just lost Ethan. She had lost the world that had agreed to see her only through him. In cafes, she felt it in glances that slid over her like she was already fading. In meetings, she watched conversations pivot around her like water flowing around a rock. She had not changed. Her intelligence, her charm, her work, none of that had disappeared. But power had shifted, and Paris, like all old cities, knows how to choose a side. She understood, with a clarity that cut, that what they'd celebrated in her had never really been her. It had been her proximity, to Ethan, to his name, to the glittering mythology of inherited power. Now, without that scaffolding, their smiles turned translucent. Their admiration dissolved like sugar in tea. The world shrank in inches. The art panels she once moderated were restructured. Her name disappeared from an awards committee she had co-founded. People who used to ask for her opinions now sent her polite updates, as though she'd retired without telling them. The city she'd once conquered began treating her like a rumor, something that had happened once, somewhere, to someone. One evening, after weeks of this slow erasure, Naomi walked through the Place Vendôme at dusk. It had rained, and the cobblestones mirrored the golden light of the street lamps. She paused at the steps of a hotel where she'd once been photographed in couture, her hand in Ethan's, cameras flashing like applause. Now, no one looked up. She stood there in the quiet glow, realizing that the erasure wasn't personal. It was structural. She'd been absorbed into a story that wasn't hers to control, then neatly cut out of it when her role was no longer useful. And yet, beneath the humiliation, something unexpected flickered. Not defiance, not yet. Something quieter. The recognition that what could be taken away so quickly had never truly belonged to her in the first place. The empire that had erased her had been built on borrowed invitations, curated rooms, and borrowed light. All of it glittering, all of it fragile. She walked away from the hotel without looking back. Paris kept spinning, but the silence no longer frightened her. It was making room for something else. The flat was so small, Naomi could cross it in 6 steps. The paint on the walls of the Belleville building peeled in faint curls, like paper tired of its own history. A single window overlooked the narrow street below, where scooters snarled through the night, carrying the restless energy of a city that was still alive, even if she wasn't. She'd traded marble floors for chipped tiles, silk sheets for linen worn thin from other people's lives. This wasn't a temporary crash pad. It was what the bottom of her world looked like. On the kitchen counter, a thin strip of formica pretending to be marble, sat a letter with the embossed crest of a law firm older than most countries. She hadn't opened it yet. She didn't have to. She already knew what it said. Ethan Whitmore had sued her. Defamation. The word alone had a weight to it, cold and corporate, like a door slamming from the inside. The claim accused her of spreading false statements detrimental to the reputation and business interests of Mr. Whitmore and Whitmore Global Logistics. It was a performance more than a case. Everyone knew it. He didn't need to win. He just needed to bleed her resources dry. The number on the projected legal costs was more than she had in every account combined. When she finally slid the letter open with the dull edge of a butter knife, the words seemed to move in slow motion. Interference with business relationships, malicious intent, financial damages, legal poetry crafted to make sure she could never breathe in Paris again. Naomi pressed her palms flat against the counter, the edges of the paper cutting into her wrists. She could still remember the man who used to trace lazy circles on her back on Sunday mornings, who used to say, "You and me against the world." Now he was throwing the world at her like a weapon. The whispers in the city had grown louder. The discarded wife had become a liability, a scandal, an easy target. Friends who hadn't already faded away did so now, not out of cruelty, but out of survival. People didn't want to choose between her and Ethan, not because they believed him more, but because he was safer to stand beside. Her company, once a spark of promise, had been starved of oxygen. Clients withdrew politely. One called it unfortunate timing. Another called it optics. They didn't want to be tied to a woman fighting an empire. No one ever does. By the second week in Belleville, she'd sold most of her jewelry. Pieces she once wore to galas now sitting behind a pawn shop's scratched glass, their brilliance dimmed. She kept one item, the slim gold bracelet her mother had given her the day she left Atlanta. A promise, she'd said then. A reminder. Some nights, Naomi stared at her laptop screen, scrolling through flight prices to Atlanta. She could almost smell the humid Georgia air, almost hear her mother's voice calling her home. She pictured packing what little she had left, boarding a flight, and erasing this city before it erased the rest of her. But every time she hovered over purchase, something inside her refused. Not pride, not exactly. It was something quieter, more dangerous. She thought of the Naomi who had arrived in Paris with fire in her lungs and a spine forged in ambition. She had crossed an ocean alone. Did she really believe this man, this lawsuit, this crumbling tower of borrowed status could undo her? The rain outside thickened, sliding down the window in long silver streaks. She pressed her forehead to the glass. From here, Paris looked nothing like the city she'd once ruled. Belleville was a different world, a heartbeat of immigrants, artists, people who built lives out of thin air and stubbornness. There was a kind of honesty to it that the gilded salons of Place Vendôme had never known. She exhaled. It wasn't steady, but it was hers. Naomi slid the laptop closed. She folded the letter from Ethan's lawyers into a small, sharp square and tucked it into the back of a drawer, as if putting away a scar she hadn't decided how to treat yet. On the small table near the window sat a half-burned candle, its wax hardened into uneven ridges. She lit it again, not for comfort, but for clarity. The truth was simple and cruel. The man who had once held her hand had now stripped away every pillar she'd leaned on. The city she'd once illuminated had closed its doors. She was broke, alone, hunted in court, a name whispered in past tense. But the other truth, quieter, deeper, was that she was still here, and that meant something. She poured herself a glass of cheap red wine, the kind that stains the lips but warms the chest. Outside, someone was playing a trumpet badly on the corner. The melody was jagged, imperfect, but it refused to stop. Naomi stared into the dark, her mind steady for the first time in months. She would not buy that plane ticket. Not yet, because what they had erased was not the woman she truly was. And what's left after rock bottom is the part that learns to fight. The rain had been falling for hours, a fine, steady mist that softened the edges of Paris. The city glimmered like wet ink, every cobblestone catching the streetlight in silver threads. Naomi sat curled in the corner of a cramped cafe on Rue de Belleville, an untouched espresso cooling beside her. She wasn't looking at the rain. She was looking at a page. The book lay open across her lap. Josephine, A Life in Motion. She'd bought it for €2 from a second-hand stall, its spine cracked, its pages worn thin from other hands. Josephine Baker's eyes stared back at her from the cover, bold, unflinching, the gaze of a woman who had been told no too many times to count. And then she found the line. They tried to exclude me, so I built my own stage. The words didn't shout, they rang, like a bell cutting through fog. Naomi read them once, then again. The air seemed to shift around her, not warmer, not softer, but sharper, clearer. She closed the book slowly, the sound of the spine echoing in her chest. She had spent months watching doors close, doors she had once been invited through with champagne in hand and silk on her shoulders. She had mourned them like someone mourning a kingdom lost. But what if those doors had never belonged to her? What if they were never the world, just someone else's stage? Outside, the rain glistened on the pavement. Naomi rose, slipped the book into her bag, and stepped out without opening her umbrella. The cold drops met her face like needles, each one waking something dormant. Paris stretched before her, not as the polished city she had once ruled at Ethan's side, but as a labyrinth she could claim for herself. She walked without aim, past the corner grocers still open at midnight, past the Algerian bakery where the smell of honey and warm dough hung thick in the air, past laughing students smoking under awnings. The city was alive, messy, layered. Not the world of glass and etiquette she had been erased from, but a city of voices that never asked permission to exist. As she turned onto a narrow street, Naomi caught her reflection in a rain-slicked window. For months, she'd avoided mirrors. She hadn't wanted to see the woman who had been replaced, the woman society had pitied. But now, beneath the streetlight, her reflection looked different. Not softer, not broken. Unwritten, the rain had soaked her hair, and drops clung to her lashes. But there was something defiant in the tilt of her chin. She saw someone who no longer needed Ethan Whitmore's world to feel real. For the first time, Naomi let herself remember how it had felt to be 23, stepping off the plane with a scholarship and a spine of steel. Back then, Paris hadn't offered her anything. She'd carved her place with sweat and wit and relentless will. She'd built herself before. She could build again. And if they wouldn't let her back on their stage, she would build her own. The idea didn't land as a thunderclap. It slid in quietly, like a match being struck in a dark room. But once lit, it refused to go out. It grew with every step she took through the rain. Naomi wandered down to the Canal Saint-Martin, the water reflecting the blurred halo of the street lamps. It was a place she and Ethan had never visited together. Too crowded, too raw, he'd said. Tonight it felt like the only place in the world that made sense. She stood on the footbridge, gripping the rusted railing, breathing in the scent of rain and city. The Seine might have belonged to his world, but this canal, this rain, this night belonged to hers. She thought of all the spaces she'd been excluded from. The galas, the galleries, the charity boards. How those spaces had convinced her they were the center of gravity. But they were just rooms, expensive rooms with expensive mirrors. The real city was here, in the people who didn't need permission to take up space. A memory rose, her mother's voice in Atlanta, low and firm. Don't wait to be invited to someone's table, baby. Build your own. The rain kept falling, but Naomi straightened, pulling her wet coat tighter around her shoulders. There was no applause in the night air, no audience to witness the shift. But something irreversible happened then. Her grief, still sharp, began to crystallize into something else. Not revenge, not even anger, direction. She turned and began walking back toward Belleville with steady steps. The streets were slick, the winds sharp, but her pace didn't waver. Somewhere between the first step and the 10th, the weight on her chest loosened. She didn't need to reclaim the world Ethan had taken from her. She needed to build one that could never be taken. On her way home, she passed a mural of Josephine Baker, painted on the side of a crumbling wall. The eyes on the mural were as fierce as the ones on the book. Naomi stopped, rain dripping down her face, and whispered the line that had changed everything. They tried to exclude me, so I'll build my own stage. And this time, she said it like a vow. Paris had always worn two faces. One was polished, gold chandeliers, marble foyers, champagne whispered over crystal rims. That was the Paris Ethan had introduced her to. The Paris that loved her until it decided it didn't. The other face was older, louder, alive. It hummed beneath the surface like a heartbeat, an undercity of markets and narrow alleys, languages colliding in the air like sparks, deals sealed with handshakes instead of signatures. This Paris had never asked for permission to exist. And now, neither would Naomi. She began walking through it the way she once walked through the salons of Place Vendôme, head high, alert, observing everything. In Belleville, the sidewalks brimmed with fruit stalls run by Algerian families who had been there for generations, their shouts in Arabic and French mingling with the scent of oranges and mint tea. The rhythm of the place was nothing like the rigid choreography of Ethan's world. It was improvised, pulsing, human. It was there, at a market stand under a faded awning, that Naomi met Samira. She was Moroccan-French, sharp-eyed, and laughed like she'd never been intimidated by a room in her life. Samira ran a small import business. Spices, textiles, tea sets with stories etched into their metal. She recognized Naomi from some article years ago, not as a discarded wife, but as the woman who'd made things happen. "You're not lost," Samira said, handing her a steaming glass of mint tea. "You're just standing in the wrong rooms." Naomi returned the next day, and the day after that. She listened more than she spoke. In these corners of Paris, no one cared about family empires or emerald necklaces. They cared about survival, invention, and building something from nothing. She saw how goods moved from neighborhood to neighborhood like quiet rebellions. How a container of mangoes from Côte d'Ivoire could fund a food truck in La Valette. How a small textile shop could turn into a cooperative supporting dozens of women. In the Afro-Caribbean cultural hub near Chateau d'Eau, Naomi found a community that pulsed with a rhythm she recognized deep in her bones. Drummers rehearsed in basements. DJs tested beats that stitched Kingston to Dakar to Paris. Street vendors carried the smells of plantains and jerk chicken, a chorus of memory and reinvention. She sat at plastic tables, listened to their stories, learned their maps of the city. Maps no tourist would ever find. One night, after a community fundraiser, she found herself sitting on a stoop with a group of Haitian entrepreneurs discussing supply chains over cheap beer. They weren't talking about theoretical business models. They were talking about containers, shipping routes, taxes, barriers, loopholes. Naomi felt something she hadn't felt in months, purpose threading itself back into her. She could speak this language. She had built strategies for global markets long before she was anyone's wife. In the 10th arrondissement, she stumbled upon something else entirely. The Tech Kids, a loose collective of immigrant and second-generation founders building apps, delivery networks, payment systems for the undercity. They met in co-working spaces with peeling paint and broken coffee machines, but their ideas were clean, dangerous, alive. One of them, Youssef, ran a logistics startup connecting neighborhood merchants to international suppliers. He listened as Naomi casually dismantled one of his expansion plans with surgical precision, then leaned back in his chair with a grin. "Where the hell have you been hiding?" he asked. "Marble floors," she said dryly. "Bad idea." They started meeting weekly, not because she needed their validation, but because here, she wasn't a ghost of a scandal. She was a strategist, a builder, one of them. She began sketching maps in notebooks, routes that stretched from Marseille to Accra, from Martinique to Parisian neighborhoods. She saw where capital didn't flow, where opportunities sat like locked doors no one had tried to open yet. While Ethan's world looked at power as something inherited, this world treated it as something forged. The most beautiful part of it was this: no one gave her permission. No one had to. Naomi started introducing merchants to tech founders, artists to logistics experts, markets to investors who actually understood community economies. She wasn't trying to replicate the salons of Parisian high society. She was building something entirely different, something resilient. And slowly, people started remembering her name, but not because of Ethan, because of what she could do. Some nights, she walked along Canal Saint-Martin after these meetings, the water glimmering in the low light. She would catch her reflection in the dark surface, not as a woman erased or betrayed or pitied, but as someone becoming again. Stronger, sharper, real. The city hadn't changed, but her position in it had shifted entirely. She was no longer a guest in someone else's empire. She was laying the foundation of her own. The decision came in the stillness of a morning when the rain finally stopped. The sky over Paris was a pale, forgiving blue, and sunlight pressed against the window of Naomi's Belleville flat, as if the city itself had paused, waiting. She stood barefoot on the cool tile floor, coffee in hand, staring at the scattered notes covering her kitchen table. Pages filled with arrows and names, supply chains and cultural markets, notes scribbled between sleepless nights. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a plan. She picked up a pen and wrote the name on a blank sheet of paper, slowly, deliberately. Bridge and Bloom. The words felt right in her mouth. Bridge, because she'd spent her entire life living between worlds, Black and American, foreign and Parisian, excluded and reborn. Bloom, because survival wasn't enough anymore. She was done shrinking to fit. It was time to grow, to build. For years, her identity had been treated as a footnote, a flourish in someone else's story. Now it would be the cornerstone of something entirely her own. Accompanied to this, she launched quietly, without champagne receptions or press releases. Just a name, a small rented office above a Senegalese cafe in the 10th arrondissement, and a website she built herself late into the night. But within those modest beginnings lived something explosive. Bridge and Bloom would be more than a consultancy. It would connect what Paris's elite had ignored, the vast, powerful network of diasporic communities across continents. Naomi understood both sides, the artisans in Paris struggling to access global markets, and the buyers abroad hungry for authentic craft and culture. She wasn't guessing at the intersection. She was the intersection. Her first clients were not the names splashed across magazines. They were the people who had believed in her when the glass castle shattered. Samira's Spice Collective, Yusuf's logistics startup, a cooperative of Guadeloupean textile artists trying to export without being swallowed by middlemen. Naomi sat with them in crowded back rooms, sketching trade maps on cheap paper, translating vision into viable strategy. She knew how to build networks. Ethan's world had taught her the polished side of commerce. The Undercity had shown her its pulse. Bridge and Bloom became the bridge between those two realities, and Naomi was the architect. Within weeks, she structured partnerships that bypassed expensive intermediaries and created direct trade routes to diasporic communities in London, New York, and Accra. She negotiated deals in 3 languages, building trust not with glossy presentations, but with lived understanding. She didn't need to prove her belonging. She already belonged. A couple cages in. The turning point came at a small artisan fair in Montreuil. Naomi stood behind a table filled with hand-woven textiles, baskets, carved wooden jewelry. As buyers wandered through, she didn't pitch. She told stories about the people behind each craft, the communities they came from, the hands that made them. The air shifted. Transactions became connections. A buyer from Toronto approached her afterward, a tall woman in a linen jacket. "This," she said, gesturing to the table, "isn't just commerce. This is culture." Naomi smiled. That's the point. From there, momentum gathered like a tide. The company's website started getting inquiries from around the world. Small businesses, independent designers, even cultural institutions. Naomi hired 2 young women she'd met at a co-working space, both children of immigrants like herself, both brilliant. They worked on laptops, salvaged from secondhand shops. The floor scattered with fabric samples and notebooks. But the energy in that room was unlike anything Naomi had ever felt in the marble silence of Ethan's world. This wasn't inherited power. This was earned power. Her days filled with meetings and late-night negotiations. There were still moments of exhaustion, nights when the city felt too big and her bank account too small. But the difference was, everything now belonged to her. Every client, every decision, every inch of growth. And something unexpected happened. The same society that had erased her began to whisper her name again, but this time differently. Not as Ethan's ex-wife, not as the fallen socialite, as Naomi Carter, founder, strategist, builder. Her unique identity, the thing that once made her an anomaly in Parisian high society, had become the beating heart of her company's success. She was no longer trying to fit into their world. She was building a new one, parallel to it. a world that thrived in the spaces they had dismissed. One evening, she lingered on the rooftop of the cafe after closing the office. Paris stretched below her like a patchwork of light. Somewhere in the distance, the Ritz still sparkled, a world she no longer craved. Belleville buzzed softly, alive with music and open windows. For the first time in years, Naomi felt something clean and powerful settle in her chest. She hadn't just survived. She had begun to build an empire. Not one made of glass, one made of stone, thread, and the hands of people who'd never been invited inside. It happened on a warm spring evening, the kind that made Paris smell faintly of lilacs and ambition. Naomi was sitting in the back room of her small Belleville office, surrounded by mismatched chairs and shipping invoices, when the call came through. She almost missed it. The old iPhone she refused to replace buzzed twice before she swiped to answer. "Naomi Carter?" a smooth, measured voice asked. "Yes," she said, standing instinctively, as though posture alone could make her sound more in control than she felt. "This is Alain Moreau. My family owns Domaine Moreau, outside Bordeaux. We've been hearing about Bridge and Bloom." She froze, not from fear but from the weight of who was speaking. Domaine Moreau wasn't some dusty small operation. It was a fifth-generation family vineyard known among sommeliers but overlooked by the powerful Parisian distribution networks. Their wines had quiet brilliance. They just didn't have the connections to make noise. "And," Alain continued, "we'd like to talk about exporting to the U.S. market. I believe you might be the person who can make that happen." For a moment, Naomi just let the words hang in the air. This wasn't another local artisan collective or a single shipment of spices. This was a vineyard with heritage, volume, and most importantly, a chance to prove Bridge and Bloom wasn't just clever. It was real. She arranged to meet him the next morning. A picket pebble and Domaine Moreau sat on rolling hills that smelled of earth and promise. Alain met her at the gate, tall, silver-streaked hair, hands that carried the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent a lifetime working the vines. As they walked through the rows of budding grapes, he spoke with the calm precision of someone who believed in what he had built. "My father always dreamed of seeing our wine in Black-owned restaurants in Harlem," Alain said. "But the big distributors don't care about vineyards like ours. We're not glamorous, not corporate enough, not loud enough." Naomi listened closely. She had learned to pay attention to what wasn't said. In that space between his words was the ache of potential left unrealized. She pitched him a strategy that wasn't just about shipping bottles. It was about story. She'd pair his old-world craftsmanship with the vibrancy of diasporic-owned hospitality groups in the U.S. She told him about Noir Roots Distributors, a Black-owned network in New York that specialized in placing niche European wines in restaurants run by chefs of color. She'd met their founder, Mariah Jenkins, during her undercity networking nights. Mariah's company was small but fierce, built on trust, culture, and shared vision. "We won't just sell your wine," Naomi said. "We'll make sure it's understood." Alain didn't reply right away. Then slowly he smiled. "I think my father would have liked you." The challenges and controls with left in support to the next day, the market pack that relates to the same time. This benefit was living in an example of the relationship methods that really does it more than. The scringe audio together to provide options evolved that the international pathward and secreted differently. It is not summoned to be essential to the energy, but it's depending with a sunshine path with business of challenges. The person will know that people overcall everywhere. This is an absolutely existence, the way of the person content, to the person will support the challenge. The advanced tachygnessability will carry along the person contributed. The great management. The next 6 weeks were a storm of work, negotiating shipping routes, securing export licenses, coordinating packaging that honored the vineyard's legacy while speaking to a new market. Naomi spent sleepless nights poring over customs regulations, emails flying back and forth between Bordeaux and Harlem. There was no safety net, no Ethan Whitmore, no inherited infrastructure, just grit, relationships, and a terrifying, electric sense of possibility. When the first shipment left France, Naomi followed it to the port at Le Havre. She stood on the dock, wind in her hair, watching pallets of Domaine Moreau wine being loaded into a cargo container bound for New York. The metallic clang of the crane sounded like punctuation marks in the story she was writing with her own hands. On the other side of the ocean, Mariah sent a voice note the moment the shipment cleared customs. "Girl, we're in, and they're already asking when the next one comes." Naomi laughed out loud, alone on the dock. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hear those words. For months she'd built Bridge and Bloom like a fortress in the shadows. This was the first crack of sunlight. The launch in New York was small but powerful. A Harlem wine bar, black-owned, filled with music and stories, hosted a tasting night for local chefs and buyers. Mariah live-streamed snippets to Naomi, who watched bleary-eyed from her Belleville flat in the middle of the night. The camera panned over glasses of deep ruby red, over smiling faces and raised toasts. A chef lifted a bottle toward the camera. This tastes like home met the world. That was the moment it landed. This wasn't just a deal. It was the proof of concept that everything Naomi had fought for, the bridges she'd built between margins and markets, could work. Orders poured in. Alan called her 2 days later, his voice shaking slightly. "My father opened a bottle last night," he said. "He cried. We've waited 5 generations for someone to believe this was possible." Naomi sat on the floor of her office, the city humming outside her window, tears streaming down her face. Not the broken kind this time, the kind that meant she'd crossed something invisible and irreversible. Bridge and Bloom wasn't surviving anymore. It was thriving. And for the first time, her name wasn't whispered in pity. It was spoken in boardrooms, in vineyards, in Harlem wine bars, on shipping manifests that spanned oceans. This was her first win, and it tasted like victory aged in oak. The envelope was cream-colored, thick as luxury, sealed with a gold-embossed crest that gleamed against the afternoon light streaming through the window of Naomi's Belleville office. It sat on top of a stack of invoices and shipping manifests, a relic from a world she had once begged to be part of. For a long time, she didn't open it. She just stared at it, fingers grazing the edges. The last time a letter like this had arrived, it had been addressed to Mrs. Ethan Whitmore. That night had been the beginning of her undoing. Now the name on the front was different. Naomi Carter, founder and CEO, Bridge and Bloom. Her breath caught. 3 years ago, this would have felt like a miracle. Now, it felt like a storm cloud rolling toward a battlefield she had already bled on. She slid her thumb under the seal. The thick paper whispered as it opened. "The Ritz Gala cordially invites Miss Naomi Carter, founder and CEO of Bridge and Bloom, to the annual International Commerce and Culture celebration." Black tie, midnight, Ritz Paris, the same ballroom where she had once stood invisible, her husband's hand on another woman's waist. The laughter of Paris's old guard echoing around her like broken glass. But this time, there was no +1. No footnote tying her existence to someone else's power. The invitation came at the height of her momentum. Bridge and Bloom had grown from a daring idea into something the city could no longer ignore. Her deals connected vineyards, textile cooperatives, artisan collectives, and global diaspora markets across 3 continents. She was no longer knocking on doors. She was building her own halls. And yet, this envelope made her hands shake. The Ritz Gala wasn't just another event. It was the event. The city's power brokers would be there. Old money, new money, and the people who decided who was allowed to sit at the table. The same people who had watched her humiliation like spectators at a play. She placed the letter on the table and stepped back as if it might burn her fingers. For years, she'd imagined this moment in 1,000 versions. Storming in triumphant, slamming doors behind her, delivering poetic justice. But the truth was quieter. Real power rarely announces itself with fireworks. She was being invited back not as a symbol, not as an accessory, but as someone who had built something too real to ignore. Particular about it. That evening, Naomi walked through Belleville with the invitation tucked in her coat pocket. The night hummed softly, food stalls sizzling, kids laughing on the sidewalk, the scent of mint tea and rain-soaked pavement. It was in these streets that she had rebuilt herself. She stopped at the footbridge over Canal Saint Martin, the same place where months ago she had whispered Josephine Baker's words like a prayer. She took the letter out and held it up to the streetlight. The gold crest caught the glow, as if daring her to return. She remembered everything, The night Ethan had introduced Clara Jensen at this very gala, the humiliation that spread like wildfire through the room, the cold faces pretending not to stare, the way her name had vanished from the guest list the following year. And now here it was again, not handed down through Ethan's assistant, not as a reluctant courtesy, an invitation sent to her directly, a recognition of power that had nothing to do with the man who had tried to erase her. She smiled, not the sweet, polite smile she used to wear at these events. This one was sharper, wiser. But first, back at her office, she placed the letter on her desk. It looked out of place between shipping ledgers and trade route maps, but also exactly where it belonged. The old world and the new one were about to collide, and this time, she would walk in on her own terms. She could already picture it, the flash bulbs at the entrance, the crystal chandeliers glittering above heads that had once looked down on her. Ethan would be there. Of course he would. He'd built his life around these rooms. But she wasn't going to the Ritz Gala to confront him. She was going to remind the room who she had become. And that, she realized with quiet satisfaction, was infinitely more dangerous. Couple every other growing today within four thing. The committee brings to recognize powers in standing around bile, if I interested new work to go toward. This new work to get toward, there is no field that of first important with incredible langs. This includes of a long, this positive for a lot. She poured herself a glass of wine, Moreau's vintage, the one that had made Bridge and Bloom a name whispered in boardrooms. She raised the glass to the letter lying under the warm light of her desk lamp. Once that invitation had been a gilded leash. Now it was just a door. And this time, Naomi Carter would walk through it as the storm, not the shadow. The car slowed before the glowing entrance of the Ritz. Cameras were already flashing, pulses of white light cutting through the Paris night. Naomi inhaled once, steady and deliberate. The city that had once watched her crumble was about to witness her return. When the driver opened the door, a hush rippled through the press line. Heads turned, conversations paused, the air shifted. She stepped out of the car like a storm wrapped in silk. The gown was unlike anything the Ritz Gala had ever seen. Midnight black silk, layered with hand-embroidered gold, its structure a breathtaking fusion of African royal couture and Parisian haute couture. The bodice was sculpted with the clean, architectural lines of Balmain, but the sweeping train carried patterns inspired by Ashanti Kente, woven in luminous threads that shimmered like a constellation with every step. A gold collar piece framed her neck like a crown. Her hair, once tamed to please someone else's world, was now arranged in a regal, braided updo, threaded with fine gold accents that caught the camera flashes like fire. Her skin glowed under the warm light of the entrance. She didn't walk up the steps. She commanded them. For a second, even the photographers forgot to shout her name. Then they began. Naomi! Naomi Carter! Turn this way, Naomi. Founder of Bridge and Bloom. Naomi, look here. This was not the woman who had once stood in this same place, humiliated and invisible. This was someone no one could look past. Inside, the ballroom glittered with its usual excess. Crystal chandeliers spilled light onto marble floors polished to a mirror's shine. The air smelled of jasmine and power. The city's elite mingled like a gallery of carefully curated paintings, elegant, fragile, self-satisfied. But tonight, their careful symmetry trembled just slightly as Naomi entered. She moved through the crowd with quiet precision, the train of her gown trailing like ink on paper. People didn't look at her. They turned toward her. Men straightened their jackets. Women studied her with something between admiration and awe. Invitations had put her name on their lips, but her presence had written it on their air. A familiar voice broke through the buzz. Naomi Carter, said Claude Boucher, editor-in-chief of Le Commerce Moderne, offering a hand and an impressed smile. The woman who built a bridge where others built walls. She shook his hand lightly. Not as a guest, as a peer. The string quartet shifted into a waltz, the kind that once filled her with quiet dread. Now the music felt like something else entirely. A stage, and she was the one setting the rhythm. And then the crowd's energy changed. She didn't have to turn to know why. Ethan had arrived. The doors parted for him the way they always did. He walked in wearing the same kind of perfectly tailored tuxedo that once used to make her heart skip. But tonight it struck her as ordinary. expected, predictable. Clara Jensen was on his arm, in a silver column gown that sparkled like a polished mirror. Beautiful, calculated, safe. The woman who had been the final wound to Naomi's old life now looked more like part of the wallpaper. Naomi didn't move. She didn't flinch. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, and then he saw her. The flicker in his expression was subtle, but unmistakable. Shock first, then something else. Slower. Recognition. She wasn't a ghost haunting his world anymore. She was a presence larger than it. As they made their way inside, whispers followed them like a tide. That's her. Bridge and Bloom, Naomi Carter. The same society that had erased her now tilted toward her, like flowers toward the sun. She lifted her chin slightly, not as a challenge, but as a reminder. To herself, not to him. Once, she had entered this ballroom as someone's wife. Now she entered it as the woman she'd become when she stopped needing permission to exist. Ethan and Clara approached the edge of the crowd. For the briefest moment, their gazes locked. It wasn't hatred she felt, not even anger. It was something far sharper. Indifference. He was standing where he had always stood, at the center of the room. But tonight, she didn't orbit around him. The center had shifted. Naomi turned away first, not with drama, with power. As she crossed the ballroom floor, a space opened around her, as if the architecture itself bent to make way. The chandelier light caught her gown again, scattering gold across the marble. In that moment, Naomi wasn't simply attending a gala. She was claiming it. The stage that had once humiliated her was now hers to command, and everyone knew it. The panel was called The Future of Global Commerce, but everyone in the ballroom knew what it really was. A stage, two names on the program, one history too loud to ignore. Naomi Carter and Ethan Whitmore sat on opposite ends of a long white table framed by golden drapery. Behind them, the Ritz's chandeliers cast the light of old money across a sea of meticulously dressed power players. The air was velvet smooth but charged, the way it gets before a thunderstorm. She could feel eyes on her even before the moderator spoke. It wasn't just curiosity, it was expectation. The woman they'd once whispered about in pity now shared the stage with the man who used to define her story. The moderator smiled, oblivious to the undercurrents. We're honored to have two remarkable leaders tonight. Let's start with Mr. Whitmore. How do you see France's role in shaping future global trade? Ethan adjusted his cufflinks, the way he always did when he wanted to project calm authority. His voice carried easily across the room. I think the answer lies in staying true to what works, he began smoothly. Stable partnerships, predictable markets, and trust in the proven frameworks of European commerce. We must protect what makes our industry strong. There were polite nods, the kind given out of habit rather than conviction. He went on. Shipping routes, port expansions, existing networks. Naomi recognized every word. They were the same phrases he'd used at galas 5 years ago, when she'd sat in the front row, pretending not to notice how narrow his vision really was. When he finished, the applause was polite, controlled, a reflex. The moderator turned to her. Miss Carter, your thoughts. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap, not a tremor in her voice. With all respect, she began, stability is not the same as strength. The room stilled. For decades, we've built commerce like a fortress. High walls, narrow gates, always guarding what's proven. But the world doesn't work like that anymore. Our greatest economic opportunities don't lie inside these walls. They're happening outside of them. In the neighborhoods you overlook, in the global communities you underestimate. People sat a little straighter. Naomi stood, not dramatically, but with the calm weight of someone who knew she belonged on the stage. Her gown moved like a shadow laced with gold, catching the chandelier light as she stepped toward the edge of the platform. Bridge and Bloom was built on the belief that the margins aren't margins at all, she continued. They're markets, they're networks, they're billions of euros in untapped potential. While some companies are polishing the old gate, others are building bridges. Between West Africa and Marseille, between the Caribbean and Lyon, between immigrant entrepreneurs and global buyers. A murmur swept through the audience, small, electric. She turned slightly, not toward Ethan, but enough that everyone could feel the contrast. The future isn't about defending what you already have. It's about expanding who gets to take part in it. The moderator blinked, momentarily speechless. Ethan shifted in his seat. She pressed on, her voice deepening with quiet fire. You talk about stability. I talk about resilience. Because resilient economies aren't built on old names. They're built on connection. And the companies that understand that first will own the century. The applause started at the back. A single pair of hands, then another, and another. Within seconds, the ballroom thundered. It wasn't the polite applause Ethan had received. It was the kind that carries weight, the kind that says, something real just happened here. Ethan's smile stayed fixed, but his knuckles tightened around the armrest of his chair. Naomi didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The moderator cleared his throat, finding his voice. Ms. Carter, that's an extraordinary perspective. Could you share a concrete example of this model in action? She smiled then, the kind of smile that belonged entirely to her. Of course. A year ago, a small vineyard in Bordeaux couldn't get a foot in the U.S. market. Traditional distributors told them no. We built a direct bridge to a Black-owned distribution network in Harlem. Their sales tripled in 6 months. That's not charity. That's strategy. That's power. That's the future. Laughter rippled, warm, approving, alive. She lowered the microphone slightly, letting the words hang. Paris doesn't need to be the gatekeeper. It can be the bridge, if it's brave enough. The applause roared now, rolling across the room like a tide that couldn't be stopped. She saw faces she recognized from the old days. People who once looked through her now leaning forward, captivated. They weren't applauding for a symbol. They were applauding for a vision. And on the far side of the stage, Ethan sat still, the master of a fading language, listening as the room that had once belonged to him began to turn toward her. Naomi Carter didn't need revenge. She had the room. She had the future. And everyone in that glittering hall knew it. The night air was soft and cool as Naomi stepped onto the terrace overlooking the Seine. Paris glittered below, the water catching the light of the city like liquid gold. The gala was still in full swing behind her. Champagne laughter, polished conversation, the waltz of power continuing without pause. But out here, it was quiet. She rested her hands on the stone balustrade, feeling the smooth chill against her palms. This was the same hotel where, not long ago, she had walked through those doors and felt the world close in around her. Now, the same walls felt weightless. Not because they'd changed, because she had. Footsteps behind her. A voice she knew without turning. Naomi. Ethan's tone was measured, like a man rehearsing what to say but knowing it won't be enough. She turned slightly. He looked exactly as he always did. Handsome, composed, practiced, but there was a tremor in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not dominance, not smugness, something quieter, humility. I wasn't going to leave without saying something, he said softly. I think I owe you that. Naomi said nothing. She didn't need to. He took a breath, staring past her at the river, as if the city itself might lend him courage. I underestimated you. Back then, I thought you needed me. I thought what I had was everything. And you, he stopped, swallowing the weight of his own history. You've built something I can't even begin to match. I see it now. There was no bitterness in his voice, just the quiet, unvarnished truth. Months ago, those words would have been everything she'd secretly ached to hear. Proof, validation, victory. But standing here, with the same glittering like a promise, Naomi felt nothing except peace. He wasn't her enemy. He was simply the past. She gave a small nod. You didn't underestimate me, Ethan. You just never really saw me. He looked at her then, really looked. For once, not like a man assessing a trophy or a threat, but like someone standing in front of a storm they can't control. She turned back to the water, and the silence between them was not tense. It was final. Good night, Ethan. She walked away without looking back. He didn't follow. 1825. Months later, her face filled the cover of Forbes Europe. The photograph captured her in her office in Belleville. Not a boardroom of gold, but the space she'd built herself. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching the glint of hand-woven textiles draped behind her, and the world map inked with new trade routes. Her arms were folded loosely, her chin tilted slightly up. Not defiant, simply sure. The Bridge Builder, How Naomi Carter Rewrote Europe's Trade Playbook. The headline read. Below, in smaller type, was a single line mentioning Ethan Whitmore. Not as a rival, not as a defining presence, just a footnote in a story that was no longer his to shape. The article chronicled how Bridge and Bloom had grown into a force, connecting diasporic markets, reshaping the language of global commerce, proving that power doesn't just belong to those who inherit it, but to those who build it with their own hands. That night, Naomi stood once again by the Seine, the magazine tucked under her arm, the city alive below. She thought of the woman who had stood in this same place years earlier. Betrayed, erased, nearly broken, she whispered to the night, "We made it." No applause, no spotlight, just the river, the stars, and a quiet, unwavering strength. Her victory wasn't loud, it was permanent. If this moment moved you, share Naomi's story with someone who needs a reminder. Your past doesn't define your power. What you build does. Like, comment, and follow for more stories of transformation, resilience, and unstoppable women rewriting their own narratives.